welcome to another episode of MFA Writers. Today we have a wonderful conversation with Natalie Warther of Bennington College. Natalie reads an amazing flash fiction piece at the top of the show and then follows it up with lots of great insider info on Bennington's low-res program. This episode was requested by Philip Clapham. Philip, I hope you like it. And if you have a program you'd like to see featured, just let us know and we'll do our best to book a guest from that program. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. Feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. We love to hear from listeners, and if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Natalie Warther. Natalie is a senior writer at 72 and Sunny, and a recent MFA graduate from the low-residency program at Bennington College, where she was a dual major in poetry and fiction. She's a prose reader for Gasher Journal and was a recent finalist in the Smoke Long Grand Micro Contest. Her most recent fiction has appeared in Hobart After Dark, X-Ray, and Maudlin House. Today, Natalie is going to read her flash fiction piece titled Box, which recently received the Editor's Choice Award from New Flash Fiction Review.
We emptied an old baker's box and put our parents inside. First Ham's, then mine. They shook their fists, but they were no bigger than salt and pepper shakers, so really, what could they do? Tension was high in the box. My father called his father a penny pincher. His mother called my mother's Afghans clownish. They argued about who'd gotten stuck with the bar bill at our rehearsal dinner, which was 17 years ago. We put the lid on and opened a bottle of Merlot. I lit cheap candles and heated a frozen pizza, which would have made both of our mothers roll over and die. "It's so quiet," my husband said. "We didn't even use plates." A few days in, the mothers still weren't talking to each other, but the fathers worked together to fashion a rope from their shirts and tiny belts. The idea was to scale the side of the box and crawl out of the handle hole, but we figured that was a stretch. The parents made reasonable requests, like, "Please, can we have full-fat creamer in the bottle cap today?" And we obliged. We're not monsters. We love our parents very much. They just, Life outside of the box was sweet. No more tiny feet soaking in the deviled egg tray, no more dentures in the shot glasses, no more looking for his father before I peed. He used to doze off in the sink and wake up shouting midstream. We put an ice cube in the box, and they took turns closing their eyes while one of them rubbed against it to get clean. His mother asked if I could make it warm, and I explained ice to her as patiently as I could. Still, they kept plotting escapes, despite how accommodating we'd been. His father, who had fewer hip surgeries than my father, got down on all fours, and they made a human pyramid with my mother at the top. I was wiping down counters with Clorox when I saw her tiny arm come out of the handle hole, followed by a tiny head. "No," she yelled, "you'll kill us all with those chemicals." She flung herself out of the hole and landed on the counter with a soft thud. Then, covering her mouth with her silk scarf, she ran like a hero towards the bottle and used all of her strength to push it into the sink. I picked her up, flicked on the burner, and dangled her over it, just until the soles of her shoes got hot. The smell of burning rubber lingered as a reminder of what happens when parents don't behave. After that, they stopped trying to escape, and we rewarded them. We doled out individual raisins as desserts, made a hot tub with an old tuna can and microwaved seltzer, and set up a miniature honky-tonk where they rode our stapler like a mechanical bull. We even planned a tropical vacation. All four of them hiked to the rain shower in the master bath and sunbathed on shoehorns in the yard. We missed our parents. We really did. But the parents we missed, the ones who'd done their best to shelter us from life's cruelty and made tea when we came home heartbroken or poor, those parents were gone long before the box. One night, I found my husband standing over the box, lid in his hand, watching them sleep. I peered in and looked down at my sleeping mother, propped up against the cardboard, smaller than the doll I'd had as a girl. I smoothed her hair back with my pinky and placed a raisin at her feet. On my dad's birthday, I rolled the smallest cigarette I could, lit it, and placed it in the box. They each took tiny puffs. My mother threw up in the corner. His mother got a head rush and immediately fell asleep. But our fathers sat there together, sucking on the butt and talking about the lives they'd lived. You should have seen that car turn heads. She sounds real special, Al. She was a real special girl. Both men began to snore. The cigarette burned down, getting smaller and smaller, the way smallness comes for us all over time.
Thank you so much for reading that. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, of course. This is so fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. That story, I swear, it just got me so good when I was reading it. I loved it. It really moved me. It made me think about the way our parents kind of recede from our lives as we age and make our own lives, like how large and important they are when we're growing up and how they inevitably take on like that smaller and smaller role as we get older. And then that last line, the cigarette burned down, getting smaller and smaller, the way smallness comes for us all over time. I loved it. That was so good. So
yeah, I
want to know how you came up with the idea for this story, like what you started with and what your process usually looks like when you have an idea.
Yeah, I mean, most of my ideas, this one included, comes from just taking notes in my life, like either a sentence on the TV or, I think a lot of writers do this, but keeping a notebook or, it's literally just the notes app in my phone where I'll write down little ideas of like, what if, especially with speculative fiction, like, what if no one could talk anymore? Or what if our parents were small and lived with us? And, I think I had a funny thought or a kind of like a Honey, I Shrunk the Kids moment. Thinking about, that first sentence kind of came to me first of just, we put our parents in a box and then what would happen from there. And this one felt really good coming out. Like it was one of those ones where you just sit down and you get kind of most of it down. The ending was really tricky, but I knew what I wanted the piece to kind of be. And the length felt really right to me. And so it did kind of just come out all in one burst. And then I was able to kind of go in and fine tune and find the tension and add in some tender moments without making it sentimental.
So when you say you knew what you wanted the story to be, do you mean like you had an idea of what the theme was going to be, or like you had an idea of just the shape of the story in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had the feeling, like I knew what the feeling was. I knew that it was like a plain telling of a sad thing, which is that we get old and our parents get old and we have to find new roles in each other's lives when we are adults and our parents are also adults.
And then you said also that you felt really good about the length of the story. So what do you think makes Flash the best form through which to tell this story? Or in other words, what do you think would be gained or lost by telling this story in 4,000 or 5,000 words as opposed to 1,000?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to go right towards Flash or shorter just because I think that my work could, and before I started to get good at writing what I write, it could be overly sentimental. But the constraints of Flash really make you look at your writing and say, what could go? Like, what could we get rid of and still have the essence of something? There's, a really nice analogy that I read at one point when I first started getting into Flash, which was that a novel gives you the entire house, a short story gives you a room, and a short or a piece of Flash gives you a keyhole to look through. And I just really love that. And I would rather, with my own writing, I find that I would rather give my reader something to think about, something that's not explained. They don't know why the parents are miniature. It's just, you get a few facts. And I also think that, at least judging by the response I've gotten from readers, is it allows you to insert yourself into the story more, So I think Box needed to be Flash because it's such a universal feeling, that sadness of the changing roles when your parents get older and you get older. And I wanted the reader to be able to insert themselves.
I love that. I love that you really kind of started mostly with a feeling, and that it sounds like to me that one of your main goals in writing this, or writing any Flash fiction piece, is to maintain that feeling without focusing on it too much, just keeping the essence of it under the surface. I love that idea. And it's also interesting, that idea that if you let the story become too long and focus on that feeling too much, it could become too sentimental.
Yeah. And I think this concept exists outside of the Flash world. Like, I'm going to show myself as being an emo indie girl. But, I remember being obsessed with this one song that was so sad. It was by this Ohio folk band. And it was just so sad, and it cut off right up, it basically just dropped right after the first verse. And it the way that it left you wanting more was so visceral, and I felt it so strongly. It just seemed like the most perfect choice that artist could have made. And, I think little things like that have always been really intriguing to me. The idea of leaving somebody wanting more. So
what was your early reading and writing life like? Have you always been an avid reader and writer? At what point did you start reading and writing Flash fiction?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I was a traditional reader and writer the way a lot of people in MFA programs were as a kid. I mean, I devoured Shel Silverstein, all those childhood books. I definitely read every night with my dad, but I wasn't the high school English nerd. I loved to write. I thought I wanted to write memoirs, and I was always keeping a journal. And up until my MFA program, literally, I wrote poetry. Very, very, very bad, overly sentimental, cheesy, corny poems that I pray to God there's a Tumblr out there somewhere that I just pray no one ever finds. But honestly, I didn't really start writing Flash until my MFA, or actually right before my MFA. I took a creative writing class at the community college in Santa Monica, and it was an amazing class. Great professor. And, you had to write a story every week. And I worked in advertising, and my job was really, really demanding. And so I basically was just turning in short stories, 1 or 2 pages, because it was what I had the time to write. And there wasn't really a length requirement. And I was like, oh, I kind of love these. These don't feel like the beginnings of stories. These feel like full stories to me. And that's kind of when I learned that Flash was even a genre. I didn't even know that was an option.
So it sounds to me like, in general, you were drawn more to the writing than you were to reading growing up?
Totally.
Why do you think that was?
I think I was a little bit... So I guess I was self-absorbed as a preteen, I thought the hand I'd been dealt was so, worthy of angsty writing, So I did a lot of self-reflection and journaling, and being the girl on the bus with her angsty journal. And I don't think I didn't come from a family of readers. So it never really seemed like books to me were books on war that my dad, and in high school we read a few that caught my attention, like Great Gatsby, all those classic Hemingway. But I wasn't really introduced to books that, one, interested me, and two, were accessible, it always felt really like hard to read. I was only really introduced to those books that feel like work to do to get through. So I think I kind of probably read like 3 books a year and just kind of avoided it.
Yeah, I have, like, my background is in teaching, so I spent some time teaching high schoolers. And one thing I would hear all the time is they would say, like, they didn't feel like they had the time to read, or that it wasn't accessible, or that they didn't have the attention span for it. So what do you think flash fiction could offer to a new generation of readers?
Well, this is like one thing I'm obsessed with, because I just think it's like the unlock. I think Flash is short enough that it can retain a reader, and diverse enough that it can cover all different types of readers can find something in the Flash genre. And it's also, one thing I try to do is post my stories on Instagram, because it's a format that can be read on a phone. And I don't think people are carrying books in their backpack on the bus anymore. I think if we could get literature onto more phones, more young people might be open to reading.
You mentioned posting on Instagram. You do this thing called Flash Fridays on Instagram, where you post flash fiction. I think it's once a month on Fridays on your Instagram account. So tell us about that. How did that start, and why did you want to do that?
Yeah, so I've mentioned that I work in advertising, and I actually, for my last semester of my MFA, took a sabbatical from work, because I just really wanted to feel what it felt like to be a writer for 6 months and only be a writer. Amazing thing. I really recommend it to anybody who can afford and has the opportunity to do something like that. But one thing that I wanted to do was find a way during that 6-month period to start getting my work out there to people who don't read lit mags. Like, there's probably 10% of readers are actually reading the lit mags, and I have maybe 1,000 followers who are already looking at my account, and why would I not put my writing in front of them? So I have maybe 2 other friends from my grad program who were doing things like this, and they really inspired me and kind of kicked me in the butt to be brave and put it out there. And honestly, it just kind of like came together. People were really nice in giving me recommendations of templates to use to design them. And then I was writing for my program. I was still writing 20 pages of fiction a month. So I always had stories that were kind of ready. And I just started posting them. At that time, I was doing 1 a week every Friday at 9 a.m. Fiction that can be read on your phone. And I would post them in stories, and I would try to make the font big and only put a certain amount of font, a certain amount of words on every slide so that it wasn't overwhelming. And I just begged people for feedback and tried to make them better every week and more engaging, easier to read. I really just tried to think of ways to make Instagram a platform for writers, because right now it is not. And it feels like such a missed opportunity. All other types of artists get to share their work on Instagram. And I think if we could figure out a way to make that platform a writer-friendly platform, we could get a lot more people reading our work.
Okay, so we've talked about the benefits of reading Flash, but what do you think the benefits are for writers in going small, writing small pieces of prose? What are the benefits for new and emerging writers?
Well, I think one thing is the benefit of finishing something in a single setting is really great for confidence. I've found it's so much easier for me in the 30 minutes that I have before meetings in the morning to sit down and get one flash fiction story out that I can then fine tune later. That feels so much better to me than getting the beginning of a long story out. So I think that's one thing. And then I also just think that like the muscle of getting a story out in one go helps you understand the arc of beginning, middle, end in a really like succinct way. You almost start to get an intuition for like, okay, and now I should be coming towards the middle. Okay, and now I need like a banger of a last line. And then now I need to look back at the title and make sure that that snaps, you know?
It was a big turning point for me as like a developing writer when I was first trying to do it. The moment that I stopped trying to write novels and just started writing the shortest stories I could, starting and finishing things, I saw improvement so quickly in a way that I never did when I was trying to write long things. So I think it's great advice. And there are quite a few really good flash fiction publications out there, a few of which make appearances in your bio, like Smoke Long Quarterly and Hobart. But in general, do you think flash gets the respect it deserves?
No, not at all. You know, I remember reading early on, I think it was Randall Brown said when he first started writing flash, his professor picked up his paper like it was like a wet rag and was like, this is not a story. And it's so true, you know, like it kind of gets kicked to the corner of the literary genre. And I don't fully understand why, because there are people who technically have been writing flash, like Kafka wrote super short, Amy Hempel, Lydia Davis. Like there's just so many, Joy Williams, there's so many wonderful, well-respected writers who write short and don't necessarily call themselves flash, probably because flash has a bad connotation. Like when I try to publish my book, I probably won't call it flash.
You have a slightly non-traditional career, at least in relation to the idea most people have of the writer's life. You mentioned that you work full-time, and it's not for a school or a literary magazine or in publishing or journalism, but it's in advertising. So I'm curious to hear you talk about that work, like how long you've been doing it and how you balance that with the writing that you do.
Yeah. I am a copywriter in advertising. I make ads. And I've been doing it for about 8 years. And, you know, it is, I go back and forth. Sometimes I love it. Sometimes I feel like a slave to marketing. But, for the most part, you know, I think I came to a crossroads while I was in the MFA where I said, okay, do I want to stay on this path of being in advertising, or do I want to kind of switch to the literary world? You know, a lot of the careers that I'm seeing my peers pursue, like in teaching and academia. And I sat down, I think it was my second term teacher, and really just talked to her, Jennifer Chang. She was wonderful. But she pointed out that, you know, she said something to me about lifestyle and how it wasn't, you know, that I didn't need to feel guilty for choosing a different lifestyle and that I was still a writer if I wasn't a teacher, which I think was important for me to hear, just because I think I have more fun in advertising than I would have in academia. And there's also just the reality of finances, you know, like this is my copywriting job allows me to write every day and also pays me a healthy salary that I will never have to worry about. I'll always be secure financially. And, you know, I think that there, unfortunately, is just the ladder in academia and the struggle of trying to become a professor or teach 10 different classes at the same time. It just takes so much effort. And I just wasn't sure that I had the passion for it that I would need to be able to be as good at it as I am at being a copywriter in advertising. So, I have come to peace with my decision, and I kind of try to talk to people about it as often as I can, just because I think more writers need permission to not pursue a job in academia if they don't, you know, necessarily want to do that. There's a lot of amazing writers who, are also good at other things and can also take different paths that lead them to a happier life, you know?
Yeah, I think that makes total sense to me. You know, there's this like really narrow idea of what writers are supposed to do, but if that narrow path puts you in a position where you are worried about money all the time and you don't have the mental bandwidth or the time to write, then what good is that to you as a writer?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I mean, there are definitely challenges. Like time is my biggest challenge. The job can be really grueling, at its worst. You're working 7 days a week, like 8 to 9. But at the same time, I think I work well in that type of pressure and constraint. Like I almost feel more diligent when I have less time. So you just find ways to make it work, like I'm not going to say that I wake up at 5 a.m. every day, but I try to at least sit down with a tea a couple of days a week before, at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. before my 9 a.m.s and just kind of start a few stories or work on first sentences or work on revising one piece. It's much slower. It's a much slower process than it was when I had 6 months off to just be writing. But it does get done. And, I stayed with my company for long enough. I think it was 6 or 7 years at that point that they did let me take a 6-month break to focus only on writing. And I was able to keep my health insurance and my computer. So, there's benefits to doing something like that, working a few years and then taking a little bit of time off rather than just constantly waking up every day and struggling.
So what made you want to pursue the MFA?
Well, so I never studied writing in my undergrad. I was a communications and art major, and that was mostly just because I was afraid, and my dad was very afraid that I would be poor and, unpublished. And I really regretted that. I always loved writing, but I didn't feel formally trained in it. And I didn't know even the simplest things, like what submittable was and how people get published. I remember before my MFA, I went to a public library class one Saturday morning and learned about submittable. And I was like, this is amazing. And I didn't have any peers I didn't have anyone in my life who was in the literary world. So I didn't feel like a writer at all. I didn't feel I could not take myself seriously, and I couldn't tell other people that I liked to write. It just didn't feel true to me.
Well, you ended up in the Bennington College MFA program, which is a 2-year low-residency program where, according to the website, writers commit as much to reading as to writing and critical literary analysis. Students in the program can focus on fiction, nonfiction, or poetry, or they may work in a dual genre. A lot of people choose the low residency route so they can stay in their jobs. Was that the case for you?
Yeah, totally. I didn't want to leave my job. I didn't want to leave LA. I had finally, just after 5 or 6 years of living here, felt like I was making relationships and, had friendships that I wasn't ready to leave. And I wasn't ready to kind of do the writing full time, nor could I really afford to. So low residency was a perfect choice for me, kind of the only thing I was considering. And I was really excited by the idea of going back to the East Coast twice a year, just because I'm from Philly. And, that was something that I could totally see myself building into my life and my travel schedule that I already kind of had of going back at Christmas and then going back once in the summer.
So in the end, do you think it was the right choice?
Yeah, 1,000%. It was definitely right for me. It allowed me to stay in my job and keep getting better as a copywriter, and staying in that lane, and staying and building relationships in California. And at the same time, on the side, I was becoming a much better writer.
Well, one thing that seems really cool about this program is that, according to the website, there is a 1-to-1 faculty to student ratio, which they say allows for true mentorship. In those times when you weren't on campus, did you feel like you still had access to the faculty and a sense of mentorship and direction in your writing?
Yeah, the system that they use is what they call packets. And every month you are sending a letter and 20 pages of your writing, which they then collect and read and then give notes on and then send back. And that process worked really well for me. Obviously professors vary in their style, and there was a level of subjectivity to the way the professors ran their time away from campus. But for the most part, I mostly felt like I had people who, I had professors who really invested in me and wanted to push me to become better. Any direct questions I had, I mostly saved everything for that one letter. So it really was kind of, you were only communicating twice or three times a month. But they were always, at the beginning of the month, you also set a reading list. So you were reading what they recommended and then writing annotations on that reading. And then, some of the most valuable information that I got back from them, separate from their comments on my writing, was the comments on my annotations and helping me change the way I think while reading, being aware of, different techniques and what's going on the page and all that kind of stuff.
What about the residencies? What did a typical one look like?
So typically I think they were 10 days, and they might have been a little bit longer than that, but somewhere around 10 days. And you show up and everybody stayed on campus. Obviously some of this was during COVID, so they were virtual, but typically you show up on campus and you get your assignment of where you're going to be staying. And most of the time your cohort, so you're basically like the class that you entered the program with, was kind of all in one house. So you get your little room and you would go to the cafeteria for dinner. And then every night there was a faculty reading. So yeah, it was cool. And it's in this really cozy barn on this beautiful campus, So it was a lot of choosing what you were going to attend, because there's so many things. I mean, the days were completely packed from 8 to 9, basically. So you would kind of just get your schedule and choose what you wanted to attend in terms of, there were guest speakers, the faculties would give lectures and classes, and then workshop, which, was every other day for 2 hours. And everyone got workshopped once. So, you had already read your classmates' work and given notes on it. And then you would spend, an entire day talking about two people's writing.
That sounds really fun. And I didn't realize, I guess, that in these low residency programs, when you go to a residency, that you're kind of choosing the events you want to attend. I guess I just assumed that like everyone was going to the same thing.
There's definitely like all of the nonfiction people will go to the nonfiction stuff. And there are required ones, like the workshop is required, but workshop was the only thing that was required. So if you wanted to go to everything, like a lot of people did, you totally could. You'd end up exhausted by the end of the day. But like a lot of the times I would, if it was, for example, nonfiction, which isn't my genre, I might go to the library and work on notes that somebody had given me on my piece, or just go to the cafeteria and catch up with someone. There's definitely a social component as well, because you're coming in with a class of somewhere around 20 people, and keeping in touch with them away from the residency as well.
So did you feel like you got an opportunity to build that community that you were looking for when you applied to the program? Yeah.
I think there were people who took more advantage of the social parts of it than I did. I would say, I'm walking away with a few close friends for sure, and people that I can always call on to read my writing and stuff. But the one thing I like about the low residency program is you can just make it what you want it to be. And I was looking less for the social aspects than some other people. So, when I went there for 10 days, I really was just trying to focus on writing and focus on reading and, give it that undivided attention that I wasn't able to give it when I was home in LA.
And then we talked about that mentorship aspect of the program. When you were at the residency, did you get a chance to meet one-on-one with professors while you were there?
Yeah, everybody gets a one-on-one with their professor for the next term to kind of talk about how it will go, and to go over your reading list. And then I was always catching up with my old professors. When you would come back to campus, you would kind of, I would shoot them an email. Do you want to grab a coffee? Or, and that was always just really nice because you get to talk about how far you came that term and really just guidance.
And another cool thing about the program is that there seems to be some flexibility in what genres you study while in the program. So you, for example, went the dual genre route and focused on both fiction and poetry. Can you tell us a bit about that decision?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think I needed to do that to be able to put poetry aside. I had just never been formally trained in either. And I had been starting to write fiction, but still kind of had this knock at the door from poetry that was like, are you sure? Are you sure we're not it? So I think I had to explore both. Quickly learned that, I just don't have the instinct for poetry that I think being really good at it requires, line breaks. And there's just there's so much that goes into a good poem that I'm so thankful that I did the 2 terms in poetry because I feel like I can read poetry better and get more out of it. But I find that when it comes to what I'm trying to communicate when writing, it comes out better in a flash fiction or even a prose poem that's almost like a hybrid. So I'm really happy that I did both. And they actually allowed me the flexibility of, I wasn't sure because there's 5 terms in a dual major instead of 4. And I wasn't sure if I wanted the last one to be poetry or fiction, in saying it another way, I didn't know what I was going to major in and what I was going to minor in. And they allowed me to just do the 2 of poetry, 2 of fiction, and then kind of decide. So I ended up being a fiction major, which I knew I was going to do after that first term in fiction. But I was really grateful that they didn't kind of make me choose which one was going to be the more weighted one until the end.
Okay, so this was one thing that I was going to ask you about. So you mentioned terms, like most students would do 4 terms. If you do a dual genre, it's 5 terms. I'm assuming a term is like a semester. Could you just maybe talk a little bit more about like the differences between a student who focuses in one genre and a student who focuses in 2 genres, the difference in like what they're required to take?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, there aren't that many differences. If you do the dual genre, you do that extra term, which is the biggest thing because you don't graduate with the class that you came in with. But, other than that, it's just one more of what you've kind of already been doing. You're just with a different group of people because, if you were studying nonfiction and now you're studying poetry, you're obviously with a different professor. And, but having been in both, they pretty much operate the same. You're still creating a reading list, reading 25 books a term, writing 20 pages a month and 2 annotations a month and sending that to your professor.
So what do you think you learned about writing fiction and writing poetry from doing both of these genres in the MFA? In what ways do you think they are different, and in what ways do you think they intersect?
Well, I mean, the most valuable thing that I learned personally is that you don't have to pick one. There are so many wonderful pieces of writing, some of my favorite pieces that I've written, that if I wanted to call them a poem, I could. And if I wanted to call them fiction, I could. That concept was just never introduced to me, I just believed that unless it was a lineated piece that's kind of felt scattered across the page, it wasn't a poem. And, that lesson just opened up a whole new category of things that I could write and things that I wanted to write. And read too. So I think that was the most valuable thing, was just the understanding that at the end, even though I studied both sides of it and I needed to understand both sides, I really did end up writing something more in the middle of both.
And so are you still writing poetry? I know you said at this point, you feel like you're a little bit more of a fiction writer than a poet, but are you still writing poetry?
It's so cringy when I do. There's like definitely the beginnings of bad poems in my notes section that are like, maybe I'll just leave this here and one day it'll become something. But, like I just, there's something so, cringy about the, like, you think of a metaphor and you're like, oh, it's genius. And then you read it a day later and you're like, oh God.
Well, I think it's great that the program allowed you to kind of explore your interests. Coming in as a poet, not sure if you still wanted to do that, but not totally sold on fiction, being able to do the dual genre, try both out. It's cool that you came in mostly writing poetry and you're leaving mostly writing fiction.
Totally. And, there are poems that I wrote in the program that I love, like my thesis at the end had to be part poetry and part fiction. And then editing those poems after putting them aside for a couple of terms was really a beautiful experience because they, I think, are poignant and expressive and really do kind of go right at the wound of my own personal life, and that is something that I'll always have. And I'm so glad that I fine-tuned those. But, I think fiction just, poetry, it feels like I almost can't write a poem about something that didn't happen to me. Whereas fiction feels like I can take things that happened to me or take feelings that I've had and put them into a fictional context. And that allows me to be separate from it and make it more interesting than my own life is,
So I'm curious about the other students in the program, because sometimes with MFA programs, certain programs will start to have a certain type of writer that they accept into the program.
Right.
And I'm curious if that happens with Bennington, if there's like a Bennington type of writer that you see in the low res program there, or if there's like a diversity of styles.
No, that's a really interesting question. I think because of the nature of the program being one that you can, that's so flexible to a busy lifestyle, you end up getting a lot of parents and people who have careers. So, that's slightly interesting in terms of like who we are outside of Bennington. A lot of moms who had their kids and then go back and realize that they really want to pursue writing. A lot of people who work in careers that they want to keep going and they can't necessarily stop. So that's the main thing that comes to mind. In terms of writing styles, I think there was an array of styles and I think an array of experience level too, like I always felt in my workshops, like there were varying levels of, expertise, which was kind of fun because you got to learn from a lot of people and see a diverse range of where people were at in their writing journey.
So students in the program start either in January or June, which is when the residencies occur. And so the deadlines to apply for the program are in September and March, respectively. Since students aren't on campus all year, with these low-res programs, there tend to be less opportunities for things like funding. But Bennington does offer a few scholarships and fellowships, it seems. So how much do you know about funding opportunities at Bennington?
Maybe not as much as somebody in admissions, but I do know, I remember researching when I applied, and I know they have a poetry scholarship, and I do know a few people who did the fellowship, teaching fellowship. So I think it's something they're trying, the fellowship at least, and those types of opportunities. I think it's something they're trying to incorporate more and encourage people to do more. But I never personally took advantage of those things just because I couldn't move to Bennington for a term. So, some of those things weren't available to me, but I do know their scholarships available.
I'm curious about that teaching fellowship because most low-res programs don't, because you're not on campus, they don't offer really many opportunities to get teaching experience. But Bennington has this residential teaching fellowship in which they bring students to campus each year to teach and live for 1 year, and they get funded and they get teaching experience. So you said you knew a few people who did that. How much can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, I wish I could tell you more. I mean, I do know the two people who did it, and I think that they would say it was a good experience. My interpretation was it was still kind of something that was the program was trying to figure out how it works. So there were a little bit of like pain points just in the fact that it's a relatively newish concept. I hope I'm right in that. I'm sure I'm going to get an email that I'm completely wrong, but yeah, as far as I understand, they provide housing and you are teaching the undergraduate Bennington kids. So it's a different type of system, but I think it works well for people who live in New York City or have, one person I know who did it, who was in my cohort, had a partner in New York City, could travel back on weekends, and was just focused on getting teaching experience for that term.
And what about other opportunities? Are there other things that are available to students that maybe I'm missing that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think. There's been a couple of times they'll do like a speaker series in different cities. One time, Mark, the program director, came out to California and gave a kind of a mini lecture on Rilke, which was super cool. And I think they kind of do little tours around the country during the off time, where if you live in Austin and we're in Austin giving this guest lecture or talk, then you can attend those. I know there was a reading in Brooklyn. I remember when I first got admitted, I was really jealous that I couldn't go to this like Bennington reading night in Brooklyn. And there's definitely a Facebook community where people keep in touch. My cohort talks on WhatsApp. So there's a lot of like meeting up at AWP or wherever you were, giving people, I heard about this contest. And so there definitely is a community that goes on even while you're away from campus.
Cool. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that before. The idea of like professors going around doing like speaking engagements at conferences, and then that's cool. As a low-res student, that's a great opportunity to like go and see your professors in person every now and then. Yeah. Yeah,
totally. It was, it was really cool. There was, I guess, a Bennington alum who offered up her house, and it was a beautiful house. And, there were all the hors d'oeuvres that you could ever want. And it was cool just to kind of see everybody outside of campus and in their normal lives. All the, anybody who was Californian came in for it.
Cool. Well, before we go, I want to give you the last word, and I want you to tell me one thing you think the program does really well and one thing that you think Bennington could improve on.
I was afraid you might ask. Yeah, I think one thing Bennington does really well is just allow for that flexibility in our lives. I've never had a professor who had a problem with me needing an extension on a deadline if work gets in the way. I've always had, and I've never really heard of professors who aren't cool with that. They are normal people with normal lives who also have things that come up. So I think just the fact that I was able to keep my life going while also getting my master, my MFA was something that I think only Bennington has really nailed. They've nailed allowing for flexibility. In terms of one thing that I think that they could do better, I think with the nature of the program being partially online, communication is just inherently going to be a little tricky, especially when it comes to things like graduation requirements and deadlines and, I guess mainly graduation requirements. It can get a little bit confusing when you're wrapping up and you've got to track your thesis, your reading, your live reading that you do. You're also like meeting with the cohort beneath you to give them advice on their last term. Like there's just so much that goes on in your last term, your last time really at Bennington. And I don't have the answer. I don't know how they could get more organized, but I think probably all MFA programs could benefit from a little bit more organization.
Yeah, I think that that's completely true. Well, this has been awesome. I'd love talking to you. I loved your story. And I think if you keep writing flash fiction like that, eventually it's going to blow up. So thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for talking to me.
Fingers crossed. Yeah, thank you. This has been a blast, and we'll have to do it again.
Yeah, why not?
All right. Thank you so much.